we're facing a situation where basically most hedge funds are now positioned for a Trump victory. At the core, it doesn't really matter if Trump wins or Kamala wins. There's a day of reckoning coming and our spending has to decrease.
Well, I feel like there's this temptation for politicians to be like, we need to raise taxes and we need to do this and we need to do all these interventions that are just wild, when the really solution is we need to take away regulation, take a step back. We need to lower taxes. There's going to be some really hard austerity measures. There's going to be a lot of budgets that need to be cut, but we need to take our hands out of this system and allow the people to work, allow people to be incentivized by free markets, by big profits, etc. And that long term will cure the issue.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Capitalist Podcast. My name's Austin Bronner. I'm here with my co-host, Cody Shirk. Dude, I'm dialed into my new studio. Feels so good for all the YouTube viewers. Step one. I've been waiting to get the studio dialed in, and it feels good. So now we're there.
I have webcam envy.
Webcam envy. Yep. You gotta step it up. You gotta step it up. Hey, so what's been going on over there, man? Last week you had gotten some surf from the hurricane. What's new in Florida?
Well, my kids didn't have school yesterday on a Monday. So if anybody has kids, you know, when your kids don't have school, you're hanging with them. So we had a 3-day weekend. It's been weird weather here in Florida. It's been kind of windy and overcast and cooler. It's been freezing. It's like mid 70s, but you can tell winter's coming here a little bit. But nothing real notable since our hurricane a week ago.
When there's school holidays that come out of nowhere. They just hit you out of nowhere. We don't realize there's one. And you're like, whoa, wait, what? There's no school on Monday?
Totally. And the kids were like, yeah, let's rage Sunday through Monday. So I just had to roll with the punches.
Well, we got a big episode today. Lots of stuff to talk about. So, but before we dive in, Cody and I have been traveling the world and investing in different places for the last 2 decades. And Cody's really been all over the world investing in stuff in Latin America, Asia, doing lots of different things. And we created this podcast to kind of keep you up to date on what's going on in the world and investing in geopolitics. And, you know, we've been getting involved with different deals in different places like Guyana, which we talked about, Latin America, kind of all over. And if you're interested in getting involved with some of these things, you got to email us. Shoot us an email at consulting@adventurecapitalist.com. We got a lot of different things going on in it. So if any of those things intrigue you, again, shoot us an email at consulting@adventurecapitalist.com and we can chat.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that because I feel like you and I talk about all the stuff that's in the news that interests us, but we're also doing a lot of stuff that we sometimes can't really mention because it's not ready to talk about, or it's something that seems kind of boring, but may be very interesting to somebody else if they reach out to us and they're looking to get into a certain market. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Totally. And a lot of the stuff we talk about tangentially is correlated to other things that we're doing in the investment side. So that's kind of the goal with the podcast. Let's dive in. So a lot of things to talk about. Let's start with something quite interesting that I know you spent some time digesting. So the Department of Defense released a budget report. This thing's a beast. And it talks a lot about spending for the Department of Defense. And I'm going to go through a little bit of the stuff in the report, just give some kind of facts, and then we can dive into what this means. So the Department of Defense budget, this is from 2023. It actually increased from $795 billion in fiscal year of 2022 to $874 billion in 2023. So about almost a 10% increase year over year. And this breakdown went through all where the money's going. And we can get kind of into like where there's some confusion about the money and what that means. It broke down spending in all 50 states, talked about contracts for various products and services, which total around $431 billion, which is kind of the majority of the spending. And then it talks about payroll and yada, yada, yada. Anyway, it's a huge breakdown. And it talks about where the money's going. I want to dive into why is this interesting to you and why were you spending your time combing through Department of Defense budget report this last week?
Yeah, this is one of those interesting things or resources that most people wouldn't think about. But as an investor, for me, this is just like icing on the cake to look for opportunities. Before I tell you the opportunities, anybody can see this report. We can share it in the show notes. It's downloadable. It's a fantastic report. I got to give it to the DOD. it's not only extremely transparent in what they're sharing, but there's charts, there's graphs. It's very visually entertaining. So it's a very, very good report for somebody who wants a high level idea of what the DoD. So why did I find this interesting? Well, first of all, I found it interesting. Their defense spending, or the U.S. defense spending, went up 10% in 1 year. And you could say that is for a lot of reasons. One, oh, we have more conflict in the world. Or two, we are expecting more conflict. Or three, we just had a lot of inflation and things got more expensive. Four, there's more bureaucracy, whatever it is. Like 10% in 1 year.
Probably a combination of all.
Probably. But 10% in 1 year. Imagine you have your family budget and then you're like, oh yeah, our expenses went up 10% last year. And like, oh, we're not going to do anything about it. We'll just do 10% for the next whatever decade. That's a path to disaster. You are going to go bankrupt. And so if you're a taxpayer in the US and you're wondering, how is the DOD budget going up 10% in 1 year? Again, I don't know exactly, but look at this report. Check out what they're spending. Look what's going on. This will make you really care about the direction of the US and the world. So that's why I found it interesting from a high level. And again, anybody can look at this. From an investor perspective, we can dive into this in just a second, but there are contracts and grants and business opportunities for people right now that you can get involved with the DoD. And when you think of DoD, you think of bombs, bullets, planes, and all that. But a lot of it's like healthcare and transportation and food and all this random stuff to support the Pentagon and all of its operations. So if you're looking to invest or be a business provider or do something there's literally websites out there that we can dive into that people can look at right now to make money on.
You can search for the open grant opportunities. There's a couple of different websites there. The way I think of it, it's like you're going to see where money's going to be going in the future if you look at some of the grants and some of the companies that are going to be awarded these things.
But a lot of the grants...
It's a whole different world.
It's totally, but a lot of the grants don't have a minimum qualification. It's basically open to anybody. Some of them are small, like you could literally submit a proposal as an individual. Most of them are for small companies, but the minimum qualifications are pretty low for a lot of their RFPs.
What's an example of some of the stuff that you were looking at?
So I was looking at overseas stuff, mostly in Latin America, and I noticed a couple of bids out there for health insurance plans for DOD personnel in these foreign countries. So, and I was like, well, how does that work out? Well, it ends up they're looking for U.S. health insurance policies that will insure these overseas DOD employees. And then I start looking at it and I'm like, this is just like traveler's insurance. This is like traveler's health insurance. I'm like, wait, I can submit a bid to get the insurance for these employees? And I think that's, first of all, for me, that's like a really boring thing. Health insurance for employees, like that doesn't interest me at all. Relating to the DOD, you're like, this has nothing to do with war. And I think that's an example of the broad spectrum of opportunities that are out there that the government's willing to pay for right now. And so that's like a very, very small kind of boring opportunity.
Before I want to talk a little bit about so when you think, you talked about the report. Mm-hmm. And on the flip side, people always talk about how the Pentagon they can't account for a lot of their money, where it's being spent, all the parts and that sort of a thing. There's some reporting from earlier this year it's called Responsible Statecraft, which I think is more of like a libertarian leaning publication that talks about how the Pentagon failed its 6th audit in a row. This is from December of this last month. And it talks a little bit about, you talked about how clear and transparent they are. I think there's a misalignment between there's the clear and transparent side, and then the reality of the fact that you're dealing with crazy amounts of property all over the world. So one of the things it talked about is last year, the Pentagon couldn't account for 61% of its $3.5 trillion in assets. And that figure increased this year to 63% of its now $3.8 trillion in assets. And what's interesting about this is that military contractors are actually the ones that hold most of these assets, and the Pentagon doesn't even know where they are. So a lot of what happens is that they will create parts, or they'll put in a request for more parts that they already own, but they don't know where they are. So they're misplacing these parts. And let's just say that they gave an example here about the F-35, that they own, that the Pentagon owns a huge pool of spare parts, but they just don't know where they are. And so all that leads to is them trying to recreate these parts overproducing. And I think their example here is that $220 billion are just lost in the ether and they don't know where they are, which connects in my mind to this whole goal that Elon has of being the Department of Government Efficiency. That this seems like a great place to dial in on some of the spending.
I couldn't agree more with mention about Elon. And if nobody knows, there's a joke right now. Well, it's not really a joke. It's kind of serious, actually. He has the Doge coin that he's pushed, the cryptocurrency coin. And then he's like, well, why don't we make this stand for what you just said? Department of, what is it?
Government Efficiency, Doge.
Yeah, Department of Government Efficiency. So if Elon went into the DOD and made them actually pass an audit or cleaned up their act to actually operate efficiently, I think doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on. Like, you're a fan of that. Like, who doesn't want a government office to be more efficient? So going back to the report really quickly, if you want to look at this report, it's very informational. And I don't want to be like a conspiracy theorist that the Pentagon's hiding things or whatnot. I think personally, it's just this bureaucratic machine that's gotten out of control over the past several decades. And the best way to, I guess, compare it on a very small scale and going back to the home finances is that let's pretend you have a basement in your house and you go to Costco every 2 months and get supplies, and you have an annual budget of how much you can pay for your toilet paper and your paper towels and your whatever, your Windex and all the stuff that you need in your house. I guess best way to explain it is the Pentagon has this basement, and in certain corners of the basement, there's like extra paper towels that they don't know about. So the next time they go to Costco, they buy too much paper towels. Now, in a house,
you have to think of it like they have like 10,000 basements.
Right. But not only that,
all
so
disconnected.
In the house, you're like, in your own house, you're like, oh, no big deal. I'll just use the paper towels. I won't buy them next time. The problem with the Pentagon is a lot of this stuff is it's expired, or they buy it and then it sits somewhere and then it becomes outdated and was never used. So the inefficiency there is not totally comparable to total apples and oranges comparison. But I just want to make it clear that the conspiracy that the Pentagon's trying to like spend all this money, I think it's just a symptom of too much bureaucracy and just too much crap going on. So we need a total overhaul of everything in the government, and the Pentagon's a perfect example of that. All of that said, again, as an investor, you look at their budget, they have $4 trillion of assets. Trillion is one of those numbers that you can't quantify. You're like, oh, trillion's more than a billion, but it's not just like a couple billion. You know, it's such a huge number that your brain just explodes. So to understand what the budget is of the DOD and what kind of investing and business opportunities there, it's like blue sky opportunity. It's so big, it's hard to understand.
I think this transitions a little bit into our next topic, earlier today, well, we're recording this on a Tuesday. So on Tuesday, Paul Tudor Jones went on to Squawk Box and did an interview. I think he's got a Robinhood Foundation thing happening right now. So he's going on to promote it, and they're asking him lots of questions about what's going on in the economy. He spoke for 20 minutes or so. And it was a really interesting, compelling interview talking about A, what he thinks is going to happen in the election, B, what he thinks, how he's positioned, and where some of the challenges coming forward. He also dives deep into taxation and some of his ideas around tax plans, which we may or may not agree with. But I want to dive into it. We'll play a little bit of the clip here so you can see some of the main takeaways.
So yes, if we're trying to stabilize debt to GDP, we want to run the most dovish monetary policy that we can without letting inflation become too much of a tax on the citizenry. So yes, all roads lead to inflation.
The part that was most interesting that I want to talk about is his thoughts on the deficit and the quote, all roads lead to inflation. Basically, he says he's long gold, Bitcoin, NASDAQ, and has zero fixed income. And that we're facing a situation where basically most hedge funds are now positioned for a Trump victory. They're starting to position for a Trump victory. He is as well. At the core, he's like, it doesn't really matter if Trump wins or Kamala wins. There's a day of reckoning coming, and our spending has to decrease. The reason I want to talk about this is we just talked about the Pentagon and the budget increasing by 10%. The reality is we're spending so much money, there's going to be changes in taxation, all these different things. And his idea is that it doesn't matter who wins. You just got to be prepared for a massive amount of inflation coming. What were your thoughts when you watched this interview?
If you watch a whole interview, he talks all about taxes. I personally disagree with a lot of what he's saying. And just to dive into that really quickly, I won't go too much. He's basically saying we need to tax more. And of course we need to tax more because the government needs more money. To take the other side of the argument, the government in general around the world, for as long as history has existed with governments, the government feels the need to intervene into economies because they feel like that's their job. Really, for me, you got to think of the government as standing back and letting the people do their own thing. It's like if you're coaching a team, you think of like Phil Jackson and Kobe Bryant and the Lakers. It's like if you overcoach a team and you're trying to tell every player what to do, the team is going to get frustrated. They're not going to be playing as well. Whereas if you just step back and kind of let the players do their magic, they're going to do really well and win the game. Now, I know that's a really tough comparison for the economy, but what I'm saying right now is I feel like there's this, well, I feel like there's this temptation for politicians to be like, we need to raise taxes and we need to do this. And we need to do all these interventions that are just fucking wild. When the really solution is we need to take away regulation. We need to take a step back. We need to lower taxes. There's going to be some really hard austerity measures. There's going to be a lot of budgets that need to be cut, but we need to take our hands out of this system and allow the people to work, allow people to be incentivized by free markets, by big profits, et cetera. And that long term will cure the issue. So sorry, that was a little bit of a segue.
To take the other side, I think his argument is that the math just doesn't work out, right? We have all this debt, and in order for us to be able to pay or to make some progress on it, we're going to have to raise taxes. And his argument is that on one hand, we're in an election year where everyone's promising the world tax cuts on this, no more tax cuts on tips, every handouts for $20,000 loans here that are all forgivable, whatever, all the handouts and bribes that come from an election year. And then you've got, on the other hand, the math that we're in an insane amount of debt, and it's growing, and we're going to somehow have to pay that off. And so I think, yeah, you can argue. I kind of tend to agree with you as well that like a lot of the stuff that needs to be done is more on the getting rid of regulation, letting the economy function. His argument is just more from the math perspective. That's what
I don't disagree with him on the math. Like, we're screwed. Even if what I just said was done, meaning less regulation, we're screwed. Like, there's no way about it. Even if we taxed ourselves nearly 100%, we're still screwed. Like, we are still overspending. So debt to GDP ratio in the US right now is over 200%. This week it went to its highest ever at 202.4%. That's double what we're producing. We're spending and we're operating this government in an unsustainable fashion. So yeah, I agree with what Paul Tudor Jones said in that regard, which is unsustainable. The math doesn't math here, and somebody's gonna have to pay the piper, and it's gonna be, which is the second part of what he was talking about. The people who are gonna pay are the ones that hold on to cash and the ones that hold on to assets and totally. Things that are liabilities instead of inflation hedged assets. And so his punchline, or the most important thing he said on that whole interview, was inflation is going to be a big issue for the time to come. And he's long metals, gold and silver. He's long Bitcoin. He's even long NASDAQ, which is interesting. And to touch on that real quickly, NASDAQ, if you're long NASDAQ, you're basically saying, hey, tech is going to be a big theme long term, but tech companies' valuations will continue to keep up with inflation. So although tech may crash or have these tough situations, long term tech is the future. So be invested in a company that's going to adjust for inflation. So I think that was the big takeaways from that interview. The taxes, we could probably debate forever.
For sure. And then commodities. I mean, he was like, commodities are so undervalued, which we've talked about in this podcast multiple times. And then, you go back a month, we were talking about gold and silver, how gold was touching all-time highs. And then silver was kind of catching up. Since then, it's been about, I think this episode, we did an episode about a month and a half ago about this. And all that's happened is gold's continued to rip, silver's continued to rip. And this is in that same vein that we've been talking about, which is it's a very unique time to have speculative assets, what people consider to be speculative assets like cryptocurrencies, and commodities moving at the same time. And I think it's at the core just levels of fear. I thought the other interesting thing he said was that, they're talking about different hedge funds and how they're positioning for a Trump victory right now. And he was skeptical a little bit of Polymarket and the fact that Polymarket was skewing so highly for Trump, just because there's more Republicans that are involved with with the betting markets. I don't know if I agree with that. I'm not totally sure. But I think it is very interesting if you listen to the mainstream media and you compare it to financial media, on the financial side, they're all positioning for Trump. On the mainstream, they're still at this very 50-50 type. You could even be following a lot of the mainstream media and have no idea that Trump has a possibility of winning. That's the part that's fascinating. That there's a huge chunk of our society right now who can't even comprehend the fact that Trump is going to win. I'm not going to say he's going to win. I don't know. I think there's a high likelihood that he's going to win, but there's many people in our society that just cannot comprehend that that's even a possibility. In Pennsylvania this last week, very interesting. Republicans they out-registered Democrats over 2-1 on the last week of voter registration. So Republicans are up 27,673 and Democrats 12,000. That is crazy to me. And it's one of those things that's not getting really reported in the mainstream press. It's one of those things where I'm kind of putting these things together thinking, okay, we're probably in for another 4 years of Trump. That's my guess. So what happens downstream of that? Is gold, like we've talked about this in the previous podcast, is commodities and gold going to continue to rally? Or are we going to move towards, is it going to be more of the traditional, US based companies that are going to thrive and pump when and if Trump wins? What are your thoughts?
There's two things going on with that, and they correlate and they don't correlate. And I'll explain. If you're in the US, of course you have, I wish Kamala wins, I wish Trump wins, whatever your opinion is. But there's pretty clear outcomes to the market of what are going to happen immediately. I'll give an example. In 2016, when Trump unexpectedly won, and I say unexpectedly because the media was predicting Hillary to just smash the polls and Trump won, gold crashed right after that. No one really remembers this. And the reason I know this is because I did a long short position on gold because I like to do an election bet for me personally. This is before Polymarket. So in 2016, I was like, I'll do gold. I ended up making a little bit of money, but I think I didn't understand how the market would have reacted as well as I should have. And what happened is that when Trump won, all the pro-business people said, wow, business and the stock market is going to rip. I'm selling gold. And that happened literally like the day after Trump won.
Sure.
Gold just went down real quick. So if you're in the US, you're asking me like, what's going to happen here? I think that's a strong argument for metals, commodities, et cetera, in the short term. I think that's something that could very possibly happen in November. This is a couple weeks away.
You're saying a strong downturn.
Yes. Because the metals have been ripping in fact, I posted something on Twitter. Well, we can show the tweet that I put up there a couple weeks ago. And I said, gold traders, be careful. By the way, I'm a gold bug, but look at the gold chart right now. It's crazy. It's like, it's going off the chart. All the, indicators are showing like this huge momentum rally that's like very, very, ripe for a correction. So anyways, that's what could happen short term with a Trump win here. And that's where I think the US eyes are on. Globally, however, we got a problem here. When I say we, like humanity has a big problem here. It correlates to what we were just discussing with what Paul Tudor Jones is saying. The math doesn't math here. And the only way you're making it to the other side here is if you hold things that are not fiat currencies, that aren't being inflated away, that aren't going to be in some financial crisis in a couple of years. And, if you're a random Chinese dude or an Indian lady or a Filipino, whatever, teenager or whatever, you have this gut feeling, what's going on. So would you rather be holding on to paper currency or would you rather be holding on to gold and silver? I think that's the bigger picture of why these metal prices are rallying and also why people's alarm bells in their head should be like starting to ring. Like, we got a problem here and the world knows it. And probably the only way to preserve your wealth through the next couple of decades is going to be commodities, hard assets, metals, crypto, things that aren't correlated to crazy government.
Inflation
policy.
is less painful than radical cuts or high taxes. And that's at the core, the thesis, which is it's better to inflate people's money away. You'll have less disruption in the society than by massively raising taxes and cutting spending. Just easier.
Yeah, it's the easiest government tax that they can implement without.
And that's if you read the Bitcoin Standard, great book, Bitcoin Standard. I mean, it talks about how the reason Bitcoin is so fascinating, interesting, is that no matter what, if there's ever an opportunity for a government to inflate the currency, instead of making hard choices, they will make that choice to inflate the currency instead of making hard choices. And that's the main argument for why Bitcoin is so relevant, powerful, and long lasting. It's going to be interesting. I kind of agree. I agree with you on the long term side of things. It's going to be interesting and choppy, and we will see. We're almost there, a couple weeks. Let's transition a little bit and talk a little bit about, I want to go into something that came out this week, which was a scientific paper that you found that I thought was quite interesting. So it's a scientific paper, and they were ultimately looking at the greenhouse gas footprint for liquid natural gas as a fuel source. And I'm gonna read kind of the end of this and give you kind of the outcome, and then we'll dive into what it means. So overall, they found that the greenhouse gas footprint for liquid natural gas as a fuel source is 33% greater than that for coal when analyzed using their, it's a GWP 20. I don't know exactly how they were analyzing it and the whole breakdown. Basically, the finding is that it understates the damage of methane from liquid natural gas, and that because of that, the footprint actually equals or exceeds that of coal. So what does this mean, and why is this interesting to you?
I need to first say a disclaimer, because I mentioned this topic to us basically in writing somewhere else recently, and I got a ton of emails of hate email, overwhelmingly from Europeans. So if you're European and listening to this, this is like a trigger topic, which is, I basically said coal is cleaner than LNG. And I'm going to explain exactly what you just did, but in depth of why it actually is cleaner than LNG. But the point is that
clean coal is like the joke.
Yeah. But the point is that we're not saying coal is a good thing. I just want to put that out there. All the hate email I got was like, Cody, you're an idiot, but the coal's not a good thing. We're not saying that. The study says
you're not a coal bug.
Yeah, I'm not a coal. Actually, I am. It's really cheap right now. So if you want to invest in coal, I think that's, what we're going to ultimately is coal is a very interesting investment right now. But the footprint of LNG, which is you take natural gas out of the ground, and that's gas. Then you take it to a facility with a pipe. At the facility, you chill it down to negative 240 degrees Fahrenheit, and that makes it 600 times smaller. And you put it on a ship. Then the ship goes across the ocean, goes to another facility where they regasify it, which is where they take the liquid, the LNG, and put it back to natural gas. Then they pipe it to a power plant, and the power plant burns it. 2/3 of the emissions footprint comes from the processing and transportation of the natural gas. The last third comes from the burning of it. You combine that all together, and it's worse than just using coal. And that's what the report says. And this isn't my opinion. It's not your opinion, Austin. This is a fact that this research found, and that is actually happening right now. The story that's important here is the U.S. is a huge LNG exporter right now to Asia and to Europe right now. And that's why this report came out to just say, like, look, the U.S. is providing all this LNG to other markets, but we got to take a harder look at what's going on here, because coal might be better, or there's other alternatives that are better. But LNG is not
specifically
this, like,
because of
thing.
the shipping.
It's all of
shipping
it.
Shipping is one part of it, right?
The shipping, the processing at the plant, like to chill it down, it all takes energy. It takes man hours. It takes all this stuff. So if you put all that carbon footprint, it's worse than just burning coal at a coal power plant. And by the way, I'm not a coal supporter necessarily, but the newer coal power plants are much cleaner than the old legacy ones. So comparing those to
one question, I don't know if you got into this. Does it talk about the movement of coal, right, and all the processing? Is it accounting on both sides then, right?
It is. Yeah. But to be clear, another part of this study, which I guess is a bit subjective, or people could poke holes into, is exactly what you said. If you're taking coal from one side of the earth and transporting it around, then of course there's all other footprints. But again, the big point here is that the environmentalist groups were kind of checking this box off, that we did this LNG study years ago, and LNG is better than coal. Well, this new study comes out and says, actually, it's not. Coal is actually better. And the much bigger picture, if you're looking at this as an investment, and you're thinking, well, so the U.S. had 400 coal power plants about 15 years ago. We only have 200 now. So the U.S. has eliminated half of the coal power plants across the United States. So the U.S. is on its way to absolutely phasing out coal power plants. China and India is a different story. China produced 95% of all coal power plants in the world last year. They built them within China. Their demand for coal is enormous. And of course, China, hopefully they eventually go away from these fuels that are harmful for the environment, but it's not going to happen for a couple of decades. So there's going to be huge demand for coal over the next several years. And coal companies are so cheap right now. They're like at a PE of like 3 or 4. A lot of them have an over 10% yield. So as an investor, this is super attractive. Of course, if you have guilt for investing them, you might want to avoid it. But that was a point into digging into this whole topic. And it's also, I think, a bigger picture generally with fossil fuels. Are we headed towards a green revolution? Is it happening? Yeah, it's happening, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be years until this thing, when I say this thing, this globe gets on the same page. We got decades more of burning fossil fuels, and there's a lot of money to be made there in that short term for people who don't mind having that guilt.
I think we're also just catching up with an understanding of how much power and energy we're going to be needed to serve the servers. All these data centers that are going to be powering AI, LLMs, all the chips need tons of power. And as you can tell, there's all these large tech companies that are getting involved with nuclear energy. They're seeing the writing on the wall that I think this is one of those things that we are kind of not prepared for. It was like, oh, we're going to reduce our amount of energy that we're going to spend or going to be outputting. And we're going to be able to transition from some of these things that were previously, quote, dirty or whatever, to something that's a little bit cleaner. Well, at the same time, now we're ramping up our energy needs and energy consumption to a point that is, I mean, Bitcoin, the big criticism of Bitcoin was that it takes a lot of energy. Well, no one's really criticizing these language models and AI. They're sucking up tons of energy.
Well, it's not only that, it's developing nations around the world, India and China. You add a couple million people who are getting attached to the grid every year, or a couple million people, though, all of a sudden get dishwashers and washing machines and microwaves and all that stuff. I mean, you can't critique those people for progressing. Like, that's what the world wants, right? We want to lift everybody up. But with that comes more energy consumption. And of course, again, you can point to the data centers, you can point to Bitcoin, but it's a fraction compared to what the developing world is consuming, just because they're raising their quality of life. And it's tempting to want to take certain angles at it, but that's just what's happening. That's reality. And we have to face it. And right now, going back to coal, for a lot of countries, it's what they have to make electricity. And it's probably not going away for a while.
Coal bug.
If you want, if you want, that's the guilt trade. That's a guilt trade. If you want to feel
the guilt trade, make money, the sin trade, coal, tobacco, alcohol, the sin.
I think there's an ETF for that.
What's that?
Isn't there an ETF? There's an ETF for that.
Yeah,
it's a sin, but it's something else. It's called
Vice, I think.
Vice, yeah, something like
gambling.
that.
Yeah, gambling as well. All right, let's do one of the things we've talked about the last couple of weeks, which is interesting, is this whole concept of non-war war. What is going on? There's obviously lots of conflict happening around the world, and this last week, big things happened. So first, interesting, that has kind of gotten under the radar, is that the U.S., for the first time, they used stealth bombers against the Houthis, and they blew up. By
the way, not kind of went under the radar. This was almost nowhere to be seen in mainstream media.
Buried. But they dumped a series of airstrikes on this last Wednesday against the Houthi militants. They struck 5 underground weapon storage sites and used B-2 stealth bombers. So it's the first time that they've ever used these long-range aircrafts to hit the Houthis. And I think it's interesting. I'm going to just read the quote here, because this was a unique demonstration of the United States' ability to target facilities that our adversaries seek to keep out of reach, no matter how deeply buried underground, hardened, or fortified. We can take action against these targets when necessary, anytime, anywhere. That's, in my opinion, as close as you're going to get from a U.S. defense official bragging about the capabilities of the U.S. government. It's like, listen, on site, anywhere, anytime, we can drop bombs. We can hit you wherever you are. There's a crazy clip from a couple years ago of this general, and I'll find it and we'll put it on this. We'll play it. He's talking about how basically the enemies of the U.S., no matter if you're an enemy of the U.S., if you choose to do harm to the U.S., and he goes on this kind of like rant, and they put some rap music behind it. He was like, at the end of the day, we will find you, we will end you, and someone else will be raising your children, which is the most like insane, gnarly thing from a U.S. defense general. I'll play the clip because it's like, what the, it's like insane. But so we hit the Houthis, right? Israel killed the top Hamas operative. And then the last thing that happened, which was very interesting, that also kind of went under the radar, is that North Korea sent troops to Ukraine to support the Russians. And one of the things I thought was interesting is last week we talked a lot about how, like, this idea of are we at World War III or not? And one of the things you mentioned was that in World War II, over 50% of countries, the reason it was a world war is they had either declared war against somebody, or they picked a side. And this last week, South Korea and North Korea picked a side. North Korea picked a side. They sent troops to Ukraine. And then South Korea took the flip side of that and demand immediate withdrawal of North Korean troops. So, Cody, update this week. What are your thoughts? What's going on? What does this mean for you, for us?
It's not getting better. Let's just say that. The world is not becoming a more peaceful place. And on top of, just to clarify, the North Koreans being in Russia and Ukraine, what's reported is that the North Koreans were sent to Russia to assist the Russians with setting up and operating these missile, let's just say, equipment produced by the North Koreans, and that's why they were there in Russia. And then they went into Ukraine. I think that information is a little fuzzy right now because there's some sources saying like they're in there in Ukraine and there's some saying not. I don't know what it is, but clearly the Russians and North Koreans are working together. That's not even a secret. Some of the missiles.
Say that again. You're saying that basically. Repeat that last thing.
So I think there's this debate of whether or not the North Koreans are in Ukraine, because that literally crosses a different wartime law that you're using foreign nations to fight your war. And you're crossing borders.
They're in Russia, though. They know that they're in Russia.
They know they're in Russia, but they also know that the Russians are using North Korean weapons because some of the weapon debris they found in Ukraine has identifications on the weapons that show that was produced or at least coming from North Korea. So I wanted to be straight about that I feel like, again, fog of war, right? But everyone's tempted to label us. What are we in? What's going on? Well, this is pretty clear escalation. This is not de-escalating. And again, we made the comparison of what did the U.S. think of World War II 2 years before the U.S. entered World War II? Well, most Americans were like, we're not getting into war. This is Europe's problem. This is not our issue. We're not entering it. And it's very similar situation to what we're in right now, which is most people in the U.S. are thinking that's Ukraine, Russia issue. You got Israel, that's their issue. Like, we're not getting sucked into that. Well, just month by month, we're getting sucked more and more into it. And to add on to the Korea issue, the North Koreans also blew up the roads and railway lines in the DMZ between South Korea and North Korea. So there was some transportation corridors to the demilitarization zone between North and South Korea that were built with the intent of increasing trade and creating this friendship between the two Koreas. Well, they just blew them up. So, I mean, like, talk about a statement, but the South Koreans also provided satellite imagery of the North Koreans loading up on ships, going to Russia and going into Ukraine. So the point is that South Korea is taking this hard stance saying like, yo, the North Koreans are clearly assisting the Russians in Ukraine, but they're also threatening us. They're blowing up the roads and railway on our border. And again, this is a bigger picture of what you're asking. Are we in World War III yet? No, we're not. But this is one step closer, one more indication that things are continuing to deteriorate globally.
I think that the question is are we going to take a step back now that the Israelis, I think I want to say his name is Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader. There's a lot of people talking about this is like the opening to be able to end the conflict in Gaza, and whether or not they're going to step through that and make a bridge to some sort of treaty and use this as a way to end it. I'm not sure. And we'll find out in the next couple of weeks if this will lead to more or less conflict. Also, one other random fact that I was reading about, apparently North Koreans have been sending balloons full of feces, cigarettes, and like empty and trash over the border into South Korea. And I was like, what? I saw this and I was like, I got to figure out why they're doing this. This is ridiculous. But yeah, there's all these balloons landing in Seoul and then they're exploding and there's just like human feces and stuff. Apparently, the reason that they're doing this is because the South Koreans were launching balloons and sending them into North Korea filled with flash drives about democracy and the future and everything going on in the world. So they decided to send shit balloons back.
If there was ever a reason for why aliens should pass over Earth, it's this right now. The alien ship hovered over Earth and was like, yo, these people are sending balloonfuls of shit to each other. We should definitely not stop here. We should keep going. This is like the highlight of human stupidity and tit for tat, like childish behavior.
So interesting, so wild. But yeah, so anyway, lots of interesting stuff happening right now. I think, again, back to the core of some of the stuff we've been talking about the last couple episodes. It's like, how do you continue to thrive and prosper as we continue to escalate in a time of conflict? Things we're talking about, commodities, Bitcoin, gold. At the end of the day, like, you just got to take care of yourself and try to figure out how can you and your family prosper during a time when it seems like there's going to be massive change, and it's continuing to roll in that direction.
There's also some clear opportunities. I just want to list them right now, just for people listening and wondering, hey, what can I get involved with right now? By the way, not investing advice. I'll put the disclaimer out there, but platinum, I've talked about this before. I think it's probably one of the most.
Platinum hasn't moved.
It hasn't moved to the down. Actually, it's moved a little bit to the upside, which is basically not moving. But yeah, the downside risk is so low on platinum right now, and the upside potential is huge right now. And if you are an investor or somebody who's looking in the world, and if you agree with us with what's going on, or maybe you disagree with us, but at least see the turmoil going on, now is the time to act on things, because this is when everyone's frozen in fear. This is the fog of war. This is whatever analogy you want to use.
Pre-election.
It's pre-election. Everyone's not making bets on anything because they want to sit on cash. And meanwhile, your wealth is just getting inflated away little by little. So now's the time to act on these little opportunities. So platinum's really interesting. Gold and silver are like easy outliers. Like, yeah, I think crypto is a really, intelligent bet to make right now. Of course, invest for your risk tolerance and really educate yourself about crypto before just, hopping on the train.
And your timeline. That's one of the things, especially with crypto. I think, people, there's always a debate from people who aren't as invested in it or haven't been following it for long. It's like, isn't it all a scam? It's like, well, there's different timelines for different coins. There are timelines that are very short for some of the coins because, again, in my opinion, 99% of them aren't going to make it past 10 years. And then there's timelines that are longer for something like a Bitcoin.
Yeah. And maybe one more message to anybody out there. Don't be afraid to get married and have kids and live your life like you're supposed to. And don't be scared that the world's going to fall apart, because the world needs people who are doers and are going to make things happen and have faith in the future. So don't be afraid of any of that.
More kids. I mean, it is the most fun thing.
Except for a 3-day weekend.
We took my son to the pumpkin patch. This last weekend, did some hay riding, picked pumpkins, chopped, we even had like the clippers. It was like one of those that you have to go clip them off. Yeah. That's the thing. You're not going to get that in Florida.
Okay, I got an investment opportunity or idea. It's those places. So anybody who has kids, listen to this. I'm talking about. If you don't have kids, listen to this, because I'm going to tell you where the gold mine is right now. You do a pumpkin patch. You do a Christmas tree lot. You do an Easter egg hunt. You do any of these things, and you got the base layer product you're selling, which is the pumpkin or the Christmas tree. But then you have all this other crap there that attracts kids to wanting to buy it. And when your kid is picking up the pumpkin, and then at the checkout line, there's some other doodad, I don't know, some stuffed animal or whatever. And the margins are obscene. And the kid's like, can I have that? And you're like, no, you can't have that. And you feel horrible. But meanwhile, the people running the show are just making like hand over fist cash. There's a good example. If anybody's been to Build-A-Bear in the mall, that place is a freaking racket. So you build your bear, then in front, you're building your bear with this person in Build-A-Bear. And then the person keeps asking the kid if they want more stuff. Do you want a ribbon around the neck? Do you want this? Do you want that? There's a heart that you can put inside the stuffed animal. That's the soul of the stuffed animal. And it's like $15. Meanwhile, the kid's like, I'll take that. And you're standing next to your kid. You're going, you're like, no, like, shut up. You're like telling the person, the builder, like, hey, it's like, drop it off. You go to leave, and it's literally like $150 bear. Anyways, I went off a tirade because you can see I've been through that whole experience before. So
there's a business. Sure. I mean, Sit Still Kids is also a good example. I don't know if you've seen this. It's it's a kids haircut place. Sit Still Kids haircuts. Mm-hmm. They have iPads. You get your haircut in a little rocket ship. They do a great job. It's so easy for kids to get haircuts there, and they just loaded the things up with stuff to buy. So when you're sitting in the waiting room waiting for your haircut, your kids trying all these toys and stuff. So they're charging basically less than normal prices for a haircut, but still pretty high. And then they're selling Beanie Babies, all these toys, excavators, all these things right there. So pretty good
upsell
business.
masters. Yeah, the upsell masters. Yeah,
Upsell masters.
that's investing recommendation for the week. Forget about world wars. Go take the money from parents right now, because parents have money. They're the consumers, they're the workers right now. Just rake them across the coals.
All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. If you do enjoy this podcast, the best thing you can possibly do is go and write us a review on Spotify or iTunes. We are working hard to expand this podcast, grow it. So if you got a lot of value out of it, go write us a review. Love to hear from you. Thank you so much. See you on next